All right. The poster says opening remarks start promptly, so I guess that means now. It's 12:30. So thank you all for coming to the opening session of the 2023 Tyler Lecture Symposium, which is made possible by a generous endowment from the Harrison Ruffin Tyler Family. It's good to see so many people here today as we begin what I hope will become a campus and community-wide conversation about the place of Indigenous people at William & Mary and in American society at large. Given that context, it's especially important to begin this event with our university's Indigenous land acknowledgement. William & Mary acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the land our campus is on today. The Cheroenhaka, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawomic, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. I'm Dr. Andrew Fisher, Associate Professor in the Department of History and Chair of the Tyler Lecture Committee this year. I'm not solely responsible for this show, though, so I'd like to thank the other members of the committee for their assistance with this symposium, which we began planning last fall. So please give a round of applause to Dr. Danielle Moretti-Langholtz of Anthropology and Native Studies, Dr. Josh Piker of History and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, and Dr. Julie Richter, is she here? She's not here, but we can clap for her anyway, of History and the National Institute for American History and Democracy. I also want to thank my department chair, Dr. Tushka Benish, for her confidence in my leadership and her leadership of our department during a challenging time in our institutions and our nation's history. I also want to thank her for sparing me the duty, at least temporarily, of serving as department chair by being much more responsible than I ever will be and setting the bar higher than I could ever hope to attain. So that's my way of saying I don't ever want to be chair of anything else ever again. Finally, I want to thank Jerron Davis, I don't know if they're here, Jerron, of University Web and Design for the beautiful posters and flyers they produced, Grace Helmick for recording this event for posterity and doing so free of charge, and our department administrator, Deneen Kelly, who I think is eating the Indian taco I just bought her, to thank her for quite literally doing almost everything else necessary to make this event happen. And the chairs in the back were just put there like 10 minutes ago. So we've been kind of on edge, especially Deneen. But she is personally responsible for the presence of the food truck outside. Hungry Arrow, I see some people already have Indian tacos. It was her brilliant idea to invite Crystal, who is Mattaponi, to this event, and Deneen saw everything through our university's occasionally nightmarish bureaucracy. So please join me in thanking her, although she's not here. And please take advantage of all that fry bread goodness while you can, because it's not easy to find here in Williamsburg. And there is some debate among our Western tribal members as to whether Virginia Indians can make fry bread, but I think it's pretty good based on what I saw. Fry bread is a good example of one of the themes of this symposium, namely Native Americans taking the lemons, or in this case the flour and lard, handed to them by settler society and making lemonade out of it. The history of Indian boarding schools in the United States is certainly bittersweet, and today you will hear stories of both oppression and resistance, domination and agency, destruction and survivance. Our speakers and their subjects span the full history of Native people's engagement with colonial education systems, from the founding of the Brafferton Indian School at William & Mary to the emergence of Haskell Indian Nations University from the checkered past of the Haskell Indian Industrial School. The theme of this year's symposium, Settler Schools, Indigenous Stories, was chosen to help commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Brafferton building and to acknowledge the ongoing Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, which Secretary of the Interior Deborah Haaland of Laguna Pueblo, launched in 2021 to uncover the facts surrounding our nation's ethnocidal attempt to kill the Indian and save the man, in the infamous words of Richard Henry Pratt. As the long-suffering students in my historian's craft class know, and some of them are in the audience, scholars have been studying this dark chapter in our history for decades. Yet public knowledge and discussion of the boarding school system and Native American history generally remains woefully inadequate. It is not a history that we can be proud of. So many people would rather not hear about it or have their children learn about it in school. For some politicians and pundits, it is a divisive subject, tainted by talk of systemic racism and critical race theory, and therefore supposedly not suitable for the K-12 curriculum in this and other states. As much as I hate to say it, though, you can't get much more systematic about racism than by establishing a federally funded school system designed to assimilate an entire race of people. Those are just the facts, and it is the job of historians to interpret them fully, honestly, and openly. As we will learn from our first speaker, there were significant differences between early colonial boarding schools such as the Brafferton and later institutions such as Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the flagship of the federal government system of off-reservation institutions. However, they are connected by some common ideological threads, most notably the assumption that Native Americans were culturally or racially deficient and therefore in need of civilizing if they were to be made legible to their colonizers and useful to British imperial or American settler colonial purposes. This common thread raises some questions, I think, about William and Mary's historical appropriation of Indians as symbols of the college, even as it largely excluded them. And Dr. Woodard was just telling our other guests about the palisade that literally excluded Native people from the campus in the 1630s. Even as it largely excluded them and African Americans from its campus between the closure of the Brafferton in the late 18th century and the rise of the civil rights movement in the mid-20th. We no longer have an Indian mascot or feather logo, and we are fortunately many decades past images like this, one from the 1920s, one from 1960, as well as the time when a white student in body paint and feathered headdress would ride out onto the football field astride a horse called Wampo, which stood for William and Mary Pony. We are still called the tribe, though, and recent conversations with students suggest that many are puzzled or even troubled by this apparent non sequitur of a name. Many of them wonder, does the majestic griffin, our new mascot, assemble in tribes? Perhaps that's the answer. I wanted to know, so I Googled it, which is something I rarely encourage students to do, especially in historian's craft. It is not an acceptable source. But I discovered that there is some confusion as to whether griffins are birds or mammals, which is all quite understandable given their anatomy, as well as the fact that they are mythical beasts. According to Lord Solar on the gaming site Eternal Warcry, which I can only assume is a credible source. He is a lord, after all. Griffins, in fact, congregate in prides or convocations. Convocation, as we heard going through the Wren building today, is a cherished tradition here at William and Mary, one I hope we will always keep. But perhaps it is time to revisit the question of whether we should still be called the tribe. That's a question way above my pay grade and beyond the scope of this symposium. But as William and Mary marks its 330th birthday and the 300th anniversary of the Brafferton building, I hope it will be among those we choose to discuss as a community committed to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is absolutely related to other significant issues such as the recruitment and retention of Native American students, faculty, and staff at an institution that is built on Indigenous lands with the enslaved labor of African Americans. Today's symposium, I'll just explain, is divided into two sessions with two speakers each. The first will run from 1 to 2:30, or we're 20 minutes ahead of schedule, so It will run from 1 to 2:30, followed by an hour break, and then a second session from 3:30 to 5. Their talks will last around a half hour, although we do have time to burn, so you can talk slowly. Their talks will last around a half hour each, leaving plenty of time at the end, after both presenters have spoken, for questions and discussion. We hope that you can all stay for the whole time, but if you do want to leave early or you need to leave early, please try to do so at the end of a talk or during the Q&A rather than in the middle of someone's remarks. Also, of course, please silence your cell phones. If you want to read some of the books our speakers have written, there is a table out front, just there, where several titles will be on sale, but only until 2 p.m. because of conflict with bookstore staffing and another event. So for the next hour and 20 minutes or so, you can buy books, and then maybe, if you're lucky, queue up during the break to get them autographed. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Buck Woodard. Buck Woodard is a cultural anthropologist at American University, but he is a William & Mary alum. He is a William & Mary PhD in anthropology. He specializes in historical and applied research, ethnographic and ethnohistorical writing, and ethnological study of Indigenous North America. His research areas include cosmology and ritual life, heritage tourism, kinship, material culture, and political economy. Currently, Dr. Woodard is continuing fieldwork among Algonquin and Iroquoians in Oklahoma, New York, and Virginia. Data from his fieldwork contributed to an interdisciplinary working group and edited volume entitled Replanting Cultures, Community-Engaged Scholarship in Indian Country, published in 2022. Previously, Dr. Woodard directed the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's American Indian Initiative from 2008 to 2016, and we have some alum here, and Historic Jamestown's Indigenous Chesapeake from 2009 to 2014. He is the co-author with Dr. Danielle Moretti-Langholtz of Building the Brafferton, the Founding, Funding, and Legacy of America's Indian School, an illustrated volume released in 2019, which is for sale out there. And that is related to his talk, which is titled Brafferton Indian School Alumni, Diplomats, Warriors, and Translators at the Edge of Empires. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Woodard.
Well, thank you all for being here. So nice to see a full room of students and faculty. Special thanks, of course, are in order to the Harrison Ruffin Tyler Department of History at William & Mary for hosting and funding today's symposium, and to Dr. Fisher and the other members of the committee for organizing, and of course the administrative and graduate coordinator Janine Kelly for coordinating all of us to get here, and my fellow speakers, Brenda Child, Sandy Whitehawk, and Dr. James Writing for agreeing to travel and participate in this important conversation. I'm going to read from the script today in hopes that I will stay on time. I will try, since we have some time, maybe go off a little on the cuff, but forgive me if I'm trying to keep to my textual words with paper. And I hope we can have a conversation and maybe answer some questions about some of the content presented this afternoon. I wish to place emphasis on the very real lives and experiences of Native students that attended William & Mary and the Brafferton Indian School 3 centuries ago. In a few minutes, I'll give some background to my title, Brafferton Indian School Alumni, Diplomats, Warriors, and Translators at the Edge of Empire. However, to do so as a cultural anthropologist, I must suspend my interest in discussing the very real engagement, advocacy, and activism that some of us have pursued over the past 2 decades with very real, living Native peoples of the present. I can't spend much time describing long-term relationship building and networking with tribal governments, overviewing the dozens of diplomatic visits to Williamsburg from Native communities who today reside in New York, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Virginia, nor the multitude of well-funded and highly visible collaborative projects produced at this university and in this old capital city with Indigenous peoples that have ancestral ties to this landscape and this institution. As an historical anthropologist, I'm equally regretful that I cannot give much time to the history of the college and the Brafferton Indian School, particularly after my colleague and I, Danielle Moretti-Langholtz, spent a dozen years or so in archival and ethnographic settings on both sides of the Atlantic, researching and writing about the founding, funding, and legacy of this storied institution, and the Native peoples who were such a critical part of the origin story. I can, however, provide some brief remarks for context, stressing the meaningful differences in education agendas, experiences, and outcomes of the 18th century Brafferton School from the industrial boarding schools of the 19th century. For clarity, I do not wish to mince words or obfuscate the Brafferton as an instrument of colonialism, nor deny its long-term impact and continuing legacy among specific Native communities. It is the Janus-faced aspect of the school that is most difficult to process, intellectually and emotionally, to reconcile the Brafferton's intersection with European power and empire with that of Native agency and strategies of accommodation and resistance. For some, our narrative may be contentious or counterintuitive, but our research is data-driven, and we have followed the evidence, with multiple Native voices coming through the documents of the past and into our discussions in the present. William and Mary and its Indian School were simultaneously founded in 1693. The Native communities asked to send one or two boys to the school were tributary tribes, those indigenous polities who had signed the 1677 and 1680 Articles of Peace. From the beginning, Williamsburg's Indian School was linked to Euro-Indian diplomacy, and the Native students who eventually attended were children of tribal leaders. To be clear, the request was not for all children to be sent to the school, only one or two from each tributary tribe, and specifically boys, not girls. Tribal leaders were encouraged to have adult escorts or proctors who could stay with the boys and ensure their safety and well-being, but most importantly, to ensure the young men would retain their indigenous languages while learning English. Language retention and multilingualism was the desired outcome, not language suppression and monolingualism. Beyond tutelage in English, the grammar school curriculum was the same for Native and non-Native students. The sons and nephews of colonial elites and tribal leaders were instructed in reading, writing, arithmetic, literature, mechanical arts, and divinity. Off and on for 20 years, they shared spaces in the main building and auxiliary facilities, classrooms, dorms, dining hall, church, and chapel. Initially, the hope of the colonial citizenry was that ministers could be trained at the college, rather than having to send their young Virginians to England to receive that education. The same hopes were placed by the settler colonials on Native students, that some would become lay preachers and spread Christianity among the Indian towns. The goal of missionization, however, faded in the early Indian school's history, and by the second decade of its operation, Native students in Williamsburg represented the annual tribute expected of treaty status tribes. That is, a student at William and Mary meant a Native polity was in alliance with the Crown, and earlier forms of tribute were suspended. By the time the Brafferton building was constructed to house the Indian School in 1723, maybe I keep that there for a moment, the institution's agenda had shifted. Native students at the school were not on the pathway to become Indian preachers, but rather reflected tribes and treaty alliance and diplomatic alliances or diplomatic relations with Virginia. As the colonials increasingly pushed west in the 1730s and 40s, the Brafferton student roster began to mirror the military and mercantile interests of the Crown in North America. In fact, in our analysis of the Brafferton enrollments, the shift in the tribal composition of the student body tracked British alliances as the frontier expanded and penetrated Native North America. By mid-century, Brafferton-educated young men from the earlier decades had grown to be adults, and they were acting as chiefly advisors, headmen, war captains, translators, liaisons, and cultural brokers, as specific points of articulation between their communities and the settler colonials, and as agents for their communities against settler colonialism. And as here, I will try to pivot and discuss a few Brafferton alumni and their roles as diplomats and warriors and translators at the edge of empires. While we have counted approximately 125 Brafferton enrollments over the course of about 80 years of the school was open, we've identified only 27 individuals' names from which to pursue research. However, in comparison, there are only 4 known colonial-era Native students from Harvard's Indian School. The Brafferton was one of the few brick buildings of Williamsburg's colonial infrastructure, alongside the main college building, now known as the Wren, the President's House, Bruton Parish Church, the Governor's Palace, the Capitol Building, and the public jail. Thus, not only in terms of enrollment, but also its stately brick edifice. Because of its stately brick edifice, the Brafferton was the most substantive colonial Indian school in British North America. The earliest known named Indian student at the college was John West, likely a close relative to the tributary Pamunkey leadership. West was noted as an Indian of the college in 1724 among the Bruton Parish records. He may have been a descendant of the Queen of Pamunkey Kakakowski's lineage, possibly named for her son, John West, and the other Pamunkey, who was the other Pamunkey signatory to the 1677 Articles of Peace. 2 of the signatory tribes of the treaty, the Iroquoian-speaking Nottoway and Algonquin-speaking Pamunkey, consistently sent students to the Brafferton in fulfillment of their treaty requirements. The Nottoway signed a separate Williamsburg Treaty in 1713, the language of which confirmed with specificity Nottoway students' attendance at school. During the next 3 decades, these 2 treaty status tribes regularly sent students to the Brafferton. Following the same pattern as other communities in the region, the Nottoway began using English surnames or monikers when dealing with the colonial officials. King Edmund Williams, Captain Sam, and Jack Will were names used by Nottoway headmen during the period. These names emerged as a result of the Indian trade, military affiliation, and familiarity with particular traders and colonials. The name scholar was used by some Nottoway during this time. And of course, this indicates an association with the college use of the term scholars, which referenced a paid scholarship to the school, such as that affiliated with the Brafferton funding from the bequest of its benefactor, Robert Boyle. Multiple Nottoway used the designation as a surname. So on screen, for instance, Robert Scholar or School Robin, Alexander Scholar, among others. Based on strong circumstantial evidence, including locating the name and signature of Scholar on Nottoway legal documents, we surmise that Robert Scholar, or School Robin, attended the Brafferton in the late 1720s or early 1730s. Robert Scholar's name appears on multiple Isle of Wight County deeds from 1738 to 45 as an adult Nottoway chief man, and sometimes with the variation of Robin, which was his nickname in the period. In one document from 1740, which is on screen, Scholar wrote the individual names of 9 Nottoway headmen, each with a confirming seal of red wax, impressed with the fingerprint of the hypothetically non-literate representative. However, no seal appeared next to Robert's name. It's the last there on the left-hand side, as his signature stood alone as confirming the agreement. Scholar's penmanship is some of the earliest physical evidence of Brafferton student literacy and reflects the ways in which the Nottoway leadership utilized Brafferton-trained men upon their return to the tribal community. Thus, despite quotes commenting that the Brafferton students, quote, returned home, instead of civilizing and converting the rest, they have immediately relapsed into infidelity and barbarism themselves. The Native communities utilized aspects of the education to serve their own purposes, particularly in officiating, reading, and translating British written agreements, such as account books for land leases and sales and treaty documents. William Byrd confirmed that some tributary Indians, like Scholar, could, quote, read and write, but, quote, some of them, too, have made the worst use of their knowledge they have acquired among the English by employing it against the benefactors. At times, native translators and scribes utilized their education for tribal agendas. Owing to the incomplete character of colonial-era manuscripts and the records of the college, only a partial list of students' names may be compiled. In some years, only the number of pupils were noted, whereas in other years, lists with specific names were recorded. So, too, individual documents reveal or allude to an Indian of the college. Other strong circumstantial evidence, such as Robert Scholar's literacy and surname, indicate a Brafferton affiliation. By the 1750s, the college had educated Nottoway students for 4 decades, and the extant Bursar's books from 1754 and 1755 list at least one Nottoway-affiliated student, alongside one from Cherokee, 5 from Pamunkey Neck, which could be Chickahominy, Mattaponi, or Pamunkey, or Rappahannock, or some other the groups that are inside Pamunkey Neck at that time, and a Delaware Iroquois. About this time, an adult named Tom Stepp began featuring prominently in the documentary record of the Nottoway. Stepp may have been a Brafferton student in the 1740s, as he had a definite close association with School Robin and Alexander Schuyler. With no written record of Stepp's attendance at the Brafferton has been found to date, his familiarity with Williamsburg, relations with elite Virginia personages, and his apparent literacy strongly suggest he was indeed a student of the college. With the start of the French and Indian War in the mid-1750s, Virginia called upon the colony's trading partners, the Cherokee and the Catawba, to take up the fight against the French and their native allies. Garrisons and forts were established along the Virginia frontier, and war parties began arriving here in Williamsburg to be supplied with weaponry and provisions before heading to the front lines. In the spring of 1756, a band of Cherokee were received by the militia of this city under arms, this is a quote, attended by a great concourse of people, and soon agreed to proceed immediately to Winchester to join our forces. The conflict also afforded smaller tributary nations, such as the Nottoway, the opportunity to resituate themselves within the colonial dynamic and reassert their roles as allies of the crown. That season, 14 Nottoway men, including Robert Schuyler, Tom Stepp, and Alexander Schuyler, joined 60 Cherokee warriors in action around Fort Cumberland, Maryland, and Winchester, Virginia. Led by James Baker of Isle of Wight, the Nottoway received buckskins for new moccasins and a coat apiece upon arrival. The Nottoway fought in several engagements against the French and Shawnee through the midsummer, alongside Thomas Cresap, Christopher Gist, all under the command of a young lieutenant colonel named George Washington. However, unable to pay the Iroquois the agreed upon bit per day, by July, Washington purchased various sundries for the Nottoways and allowed them to retire from the battlefront with their newly acquired sidearms. In August, as the Nottoway headed for Southampton, Washington called upon Captain Tom of the Nottoway to deliver a written speech and wampum strands to the Tuscarora chief men in North Carolina. Stepp had proven himself a worthy ally during the summer, and as a likely Brafferton alumnus, his literacy allowed Washington to address the Tuscarora through Stepp as a proxy. Washington's goal was to raise more warriors for the next season of fighting against the French. As Virginia enlistments dwindled in September of 1756, Washington encouraged Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie to monetarily pay the Nottoway and Tuscarora to fight alongside the colonials. When Lieutenant Baker returned to Isle of Wight in December, Washington again asked for the Nottoway and Tuscarora to come to his assistance. Tom Stepp was successful in his overture to the Tuscarora, and in March of 57, Lieutenant Baker, the Tuscarora King James Blunt, 39 Tuscarora, 13 Nottoways, 7 Maharans, and 2 Saponis arrived in Williamsburg to join Virginia's fight against the French. They were supplied armaments from the magazine, which is just down the street, Duke of Gloucester Street still today, ammunition, clothing, paint, and blankets to encourage and sustain them. Too old to fight, King Blunt's diplomatic visit to Williamsburg was his first in some years. He produced Washington and Stepp's Tuscarora speech to the governor and designated Captain Jack to lead the war party, join Lieutenant Baker's column to Fredericksburg, and take the band on to Winchester. By mid-month, over 300 warriors had followed, including Catawba under Hagler and the Cherokee under Second Yellow Bird. A large display of presents was organized for the Indians' enlistment, but the British struggled to have enough materials to continually supply the natives and were challenged by the task of managing the Indian parties. By 1757, several Nottoway warriors distinguished themselves, and Washington personally suggested that Governor Dinwiddie recognize their efforts. Among them was, quote, Captain Tom, the chief of the Nottoways. He has received less and deserves more than any of them, as he used great pains to bring the Tuscaroras and has met with no reward for it, although he was promised one. Thomas Stepp and the other tributaries fought through the summer, providing war parties from Fort Cumberland and Fort Loudon against the French and the Shawnee around Fort Duquesne and Logstown. By the fall, most of the Indians had retired. About half of the Nottoway Tuscarora band rejoined the fight in the summer and fall of 58, meeting Washington's escort above Williamsburg at King William County's courthouse. They served at Fort Loudon in Winchester, which is a drawing up on screen, Fort Cumberland in Maryland, and Fort Bedford or Raystown, Pennsylvania, providing raiding parties and armed guards for colonial supplies. More than once, Tom Stepp was identified as a leader of escorts on special mission for Washington's designs. Researchers of Washington's papers suggest Stepp was, quote, particularly well known to the lieutenant colonel and those men who shared his correspondence with Winchester and Fort Cumberland, appearing uniquely by the first name Tom, Brother Tom, or Captain Tom. Provisioned by General Forbes in new armaments, the Nottoway-Tuscarora remained in the fight when many Cherokee abandoned the effort. Arriving as part of Washington's Virginia Regiment, they scouted the Forbes Road toward Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, and according to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bouquet and others, quote, fought very well all last summer and in fall in conjunction with His Majesty's forces against the French, faithfully and honestly until the reduction of Fort Duquesne. Later, the House of Burgesses noted that the battlefield accomplishments of several former Brafferton students, including Tom Stepp, Robert Scholar, and Alex Scholar, Nottoway Indians, were in the service of this colony and did behave themselves with great bravery during the last campaign, particularly Tom Stepp, who distinguished himself very remarkably in the action before Fort Duquesne, under the command of Major Grant. In recognition of this service, the House agreed to further compensate the Nottoway. Quote, Tom Stepp ought to be allowed 10 pounds, and the other three Indians 5 pounds each, as a reward for their service. Recommended to the governor by George Washington, Stepp was further decorated with the purchase of a silver gorget, a suit of clothes to be presented to Captain Thomas Stepp, one of the Nottoway Indians, as a mark of distinction and as a reward for his brave and gallant behavior during the last campaign, end quote. Reconstructing these narratives required the triangulation of data from multiple sources and repositories to include the Blow family papers here at William & Mary, the papers of George Washington at the Library of Congress and the University of Virginia, and the Nottoway descendant community. Once these resources were connected, the actions of Nottoway Captain Tom Stepp and his association with notable historical personages during the French and Indian War, such as Henry Bouquet and George Washington, emerges. The House of Burgesses' recognition of Stepp and the scholars' quote, brave and gallant behavior during the French and Indian War was a rare, if not unique, public accolade extended to specific tributary Indians. That Washington and others spoke of Brother Tom in such familiar terms and trusted him as an emissary and war leader identifies Stepp as a Nottoway person of unusual distinction. Washington's 1756 speech to the Tuscarora demonstrates that Stepp was literate and that he could readily translate English into Iroquoian oratory, a skill set Washington valued. Stepp's role in organizing Nottoway-Tuscarora war parties, dutifully carrying out assigned orders within a hierarchy, and his navigation of Indian towns, urban spaces, and the frontier all suggest an individual knowledgeable of these disparate environs and peoples, and someone who was comfortable moving among them. The scholars in Tom Stepp continued to figure prominently in Nottoway politics of the 1750s. A number of Meherrin, Nottoway, and Tuscarora moved from their Virginia-Carolina reservations in the mid-1760s, the body taking residence in New York among their Iroquois brethren. No doubt the connections made during the late Northern War rekindled kinship ties with the Iroquois and Six Nations. A portion of the Nottoway-Tuscarora communities, however, remained in Virginia, but became increasingly politically isolated and marginalized. Captain Tom and School Robin's descendants and relatives continued in Southampton County, where the scholar and Stepp surname survived among residents of the Nottoway Reservation well into the 19th century. Increasingly, Virginia coveted and settled native lands on the western edges of the colony, pushing the frontier's edge well beyond the Piedmont. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains, native peoples controlled the territory. Born in 1745 in the Cherokee Overhill town of Sedaco, in what is today Tennessee, Charles Murphy was the son of a Cherokee woman and an Indian trader of Scottish descent. By the mid-1750s, the Cherokee were one of the strongest native trading partners of the Virginia colony, a relationship that dated back to the end of the 17th century. Pack horses annually carrying thousands of Cherokee deerskins and fur pelts came to James River warehouses, only second to tobacco and taxed exports used to support Virginia's colonial infrastructure. Trade goods of English woolens and irons, gunpowder, shot, kettles, glass beads, and, quote, other items too tedious to mention, flowed in the opposite direction to Cherokee towns throughout the southern Appalachians. Thus, trade, alliance, and boundary maintenance framed Cherokee-Williamsburg relations during the mid-18th century. Dozens of Indian traders, including the Murphys, were settled and intermarried among all the Cherokee towns. As matrilineal members of their mothers' clans, male children and grandchildren of Indian traders and Cherokee women were affiliated with both indigenous and colonial communities, however, not always fully integrated into either. By the end of the 18th century, a mixed-blood class of Cherokee had emerged, many with the ability to navigate both Indian and white society. It was during the late 1740s and early 50s that Cherokee trade with Virginia increased, and as an outcome, there was interest in recruiting Cherokee boys about 10 years of age to attend the Brafferton. Hopes were that these native students would solidify Virginia's relationship with the Cherokee through producing sympathetic, like-minded, and culturally conversant young adults of Cherokee Virginia orientation. In the early 1750s, several Cherokee students arrived in Williamsburg, and Charles Murphy appears to have been part of this group. Whether he came earlier or stayed longer is unclear from the documentary record, but Murphy was listed on screen there in the 1754 and 55 Indians roster of the college. Some Cherokee students, however, did not, quote, did not like confinement, and of course, no inclination to learning. They were too old. They could not be reconciled to their books. They went away of their own accord without leave. The character of Murphy's experience at the Brafferton is not known, but he stayed for at least 2 years, if not more. He emerged from the experience literate, multilingual, and with strong attachments to Virginia. 20 years later, literate and bilingual Charles Murphy lived in the Overhill Cherokee towns near the colonial Watauga settlements of Virginia's western Fincastle County. During the 1774 conflict known as Dunmore's War, Charles Murphy was active as a translator and messenger on the Virginia frontier. As conflict emerged in what was now West Virginia and Ohio between colonials and the Shawnee, multiple war parties and militias were mobilized along the river tributaries and mountain ranges of the disputed western edge of the Virginia colony. The Shawnee and their Mingo allies attacked settlements in southwestern Virginia. Inevitably, Cherokee towns affiliated with the Clinch, Holston, and Watauga rivers were also drawn into the conflict. Both native communities and frontier whites were up in arms, and daily skirmishes and ambushes were reported throughout the Cherokee border country. As Shawnee and Mingo warriors focused on the western marching Virginia armies, some young Cherokee men took the opportunity to attack frontier settlements, gain war honors, and settle scores with traders. In mid-October, the Shawnee and Virginians fought a pitched battle at Point Pleasant, with a stalemate and an Indian retreat resulting in peace negotiations. Word of the cessation of hostilities spread quickly among the native communities, from the Great Lakes to the southern Appalachians. In October, a Virginia officer wrote, quote, "Last night I received a letter from Captain Thompson. He informs me that one Murphy, a half-breed Cherokee, has come to Watauga as a messenger for some of the Cherokee chiefs," end quote. Apparently, the Overhill Cherokee leadership wished to reestablish peace with Virginia and laid the blame for the recent skirmishes on rogue elements. Murphy informed the Watauga inhabitants that a number of their young Cherokee men had gone out to war contrary to the chief's consent. Using a tactic common of the era, the Cherokee reversed their position after Lord Dunmore's truce with the Shawnee and blamed hot-tempered young men from Cherokee towns for the recent hostilities towards the colonials. Charles Murphy was sent by the chiefs of the Overhill Cherokee, capital town of Chota, to act as an intermediary between Virginians and the Cherokee. By the mid-century, former Brafferton students served as interpreter, liaison, and messenger. These roles were particularly suited for those Brafferton alumni from native communities on the border of Virginia settlements, as exemplified by Charles Murphy's acting as a middleman between the Cherokee and Virginians. Murphy soon appeared in the era's historical record in the capacity of Cherokee interpreter. In our analyzing Cherokee British policy of the period, one should recognize the position of interpreter was far more than a mere translator. An interpreter bridged not only language but also culture, transmitting not only literal spoken words but also their meanings and nuances. Charles Murphy, familiar with Williamsburg and Virginia, became a critical middleman between the Overhill Cherokee and the rebel government of Patrick Henry during the American Revolution. As American patriots took control of Virginia in 1775, the chaos of the period encouraged Cherokee warriors to once again strike the encroaching white settlements along the tributaries of the Holston and Watauga rivers. The Iroquois, British northern Indian allies, instigated Cherokee attacks against the American encroachment on the previously established British Cherokee territorial boundaries. The Cherokee were caught in the changing dynamic of long-established British alliances and the emerging realities of an American revolution. In retaliation for Cherokee's support of the British, and Indian tax on the frontier. In 1776, militias from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia stormed through Cherokee country, laying waste to cornfields and burning the lower, middle, and valley Cherokee towns. Fleeing natives found no refuge, as Virginia's Colonel William Christian also scourged the overhill communities. Sparing the mother town of Chota, Christian and his brother-in-law, Governor Patrick Henry, believed the capital was adverse to the recent hostilities. As the Virginia soldiers approached the overhill mother town, the Raven of Chota, Savannah-Nuka, sent a flag of truce by the way of Trader Nathaniel Gist. Headmen Attakullakulla and Onocotastota agreed to meet with Colonel Christian at the Long Island of the Holston. The conference secured a temporary peace and the exchange of prisoners and an agreement to meet in the spring to secure a formal treaty. Serving as the translator for the Virginia talks was Charles Murphy, quote, a half-breed, Brafferton-educated Cherokee interpreter. Through Murphy, Cherokee headmen discussed their grievances and negotiated terms with the Virginia commissioners. Following the Long Island talks and a good security for the performance of their promises, Attakullakulla, Onocotastota, and the Pigeon led a delegation of upwards of 40 gentlemen and ladies of the Cherokee Nation to Williamsburg for a negotiation of peace. There, with Murphy as interpreter for Governor Patrick Henry, the chiefs would hear his talks and receive presents. Per the order of the governor, the Cherokee men all received new shirts, along with leggings, breechcloths, Dutch blankets. The women received flowered prints and skirts of the best linen. Chiefly men were giving shirts of fine linen and ruffles and English-style shoes. Interpreter Charles Murphy, called the half-Indian in the public store records, was singled out for a distinguished gift. He was given a felted and laced cocked hat. Following Murphy's translation of the talks and distribution of the gifts, the Cherokee favored the public with a dance on the palace green in front of a considerable number of spectators. After the 77 visit to Williamsburg, the Overhill Cherokee signed treaties at Fort Henry near the great island of the Holston. Murphy and Joseph Van, both public interpreters, were the lead translators of the negotiations between the fledgling states and the Cherokee. The Treaty of Long Island on the Holston opened the Cumberland Gap to the Virginians and forced the Cherokee to cede all of their lands east of the Blue Ridge. The 77 articles of land cessions were confirmed by a second series of talks in 1781, to which, quote, Charles Murphy, being sent by the warriors, again acted as a messenger and interpreter. The Indian agent to the Cherokee, Joseph Martin, wrote Governor Thomas Jefferson requesting the governor's attendance at the renewed Long Island talks. Should it be any way convenient, he said, I should be glad if you would come down immediately. Murphy gives a most satisfactory account. If you cannot come, please write. I will endeavor to keep Murphy until I hear or see from you, or until I see or hear from you. However, the 81 treaty talks of Long Island were officiated by General Nathaniel Greene, with over 600 Cherokee in attendance. In addition to Old Tassel, the Cherokee beloved women, including Nanyehi or Nancy Ward, delivered passionate speeches to the Virginia commissioners, which succeeded in staving off additional Cherokee land cessions. Charles Murphy was the linguister also of the Treaty of Dumpling Creek, which was the only treaty signed between the short-lived state of Franklin and a native community. From previously successful interpretations under Governors Henry and Jefferson, Murphy's recognized abilities may have played a role in Governor John Sevier's invitation for Murphy to negotiate this treaty agreement. Rather than a failed exercise to produce agents for civilizing the Cherokee, the Brafferton trained students of the mid-century to act as liaisons between native nations and the British colony. Cherokee leaders such as Attakullakulla utilized Murphy's Brafferton skill sets of interpreter and linguister as communication and negotiation tools. Governors such as Henry and Jefferson entrusted Murphy to translate Virginia's agenda as the public interpreter, both at the Capitol and in multiple treaty talks. As a minor but noteworthy historical figure, Murphy stood next to the pivotal Cherokee and Virginia personages of the 1770s and 1780s. Murphy's story is one example of the forgotten accomplishments and contributions to American and Native American statecraft by Brafferton-educated Indians. As demonstrated by the narrative of the Nottoway scholars and Tom Stepp, Charles Murphy's experience was not a singular one. There are multiple other examples from the ranks of the Brafferton alumni. John Montour, for instance, a Delaware Oneida became an important individual during the American Revolution. Henry Bawbee was a spy for both the Americans and the British, was captured during the American Revolution. There are individuals like John Nettles, who became an interpreter for the Catawba Nation and served George Washington on 2 separate occasions, one at his reservation as well as Mount Vernon, and other individuals like Pamunkey, Robert Mush, who eventually became a preacher after serving in the Virginia regiments of foot at just about every major battle, including Yorktown here in the Williamsburg area. If you'd like to learn more about the Brafferton in terms of recent research, I will direct you to the ongoing exhibit right now that's still up for a few more weeks, Remembering William and Mary's Brafferton Indian School, curated by Danielle Moretti-Langholtz. There are primary documents and other materials that are on exhibit at SWIM Library. We've also revamped William and Mary's, about 10 web pages of Brafferton content for public facing, so if you do Google, you may be able to find some new information, new scholarship about the Brafferton. And we've also, of course, as Dr. Fisher mentioned, have the Building the Brafferton book for sale out front. And there's also some new material posted to Omohundro's Commonplace electronic journal about William and Mary's Nottoway Quarter, the political economy of institutional slavery and settler colonialism that benefited the college through the 18th century. But I'll conclude my remarks to allow my colleague to share her perspective on the 19th century or other, the boarding schools of the later period. But I will conclude by saying that this anniversary, this 300th year anniversary, in the words of Annette Sanook Clapsaddle, member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee and our first Brafferton Legacy Chair, that it's really not about the building. It's more about our shared history. It's more about the relationships between our communities and the opportunities and potential for the future. And that's spoken for Cherokee people at this institution. So I hope we embrace those words of Annette Sanook Clapsaddle. They are inside that Brafferton basket, which was one of 4 commissioned pieces that the Muscarelli funded in 2016 and 2017 from 4 Native artists. That one from Shan Goshorn, also of the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And it's a fantastic basket that has both the sun of knowledge on the top and the sun symbol of the Cherokee on the bottom, with the Brafferton mixed in between the building and the names of the students, and then inside the basket, the words, a longer version of Annette's speech at the Brafferton dedication in 2011. Thank you very much for your attention.